It is my pleasure now to introduce our morning plenary speakers, Dan and Samuel Habib, for their collaborative presentation, Our Family Journey. Dan and Samuel, as Uncle Willie has mentioned, are joining us live from Concord, New Hampshire in the United States. Dan and Samuel are seasoned public speakers and disability rights advocates. They are also Emmy Award-winning filmmakers, winning an Emmy in 2023 for their documentary, My Disability Roadmap. Dan is the Inclusive Communities Project Director at Westchester Institute for Human Development and the creator of several other documentaries, such as Intelligent Lives, Who Cares About Kelsey, and Including Samuel. Dan also served on the President's Committee for People with Intellectual Disabilities under President Obama. Dan presented virtually for Crew back in 2016 with a focus on his documentary, Including Samuel, which chronicled the Habib family's efforts to include a young Samuel in every facet of their lives. Samuel Habib is now 25 years old and works part-time as a multimedia production assistant at Westchester Institute for Human Development, is a nationally and internationally known speaker, and recently became a student at Southern New Hampshire University. Samuel has recently co-directed another feature film, The Ride Ahead, with his dad, Dan, which he will let us know more about today. And although we wish we had the time today to share the full version of the film, Samuel will share the trailer with us. Samuel is also a huge sports fan. And if you are here today, Samuel, no doubt you would be pulled up for many conversations over the break about Australian sports such as rugby league and AFL. Without giving too much away about the presentations, Dan will start today by sharing with us key learnings from his family and for the wider community as they have ensured Samuel's inclusion. Samuel will then share with us his inclusive life growing up, transition planning and advocacy work, and his experiences as a filmmaker. At the end of Samuel's presentation, we will have 10 to 15, hopefully 15 minutes for Q&A with you, the audience. So please, as you listen, note your key questions that you have. Without further ado, I now hand over to Dan Habib.
Great. Thank you, Ainsley, so much. Thank you, everyone. It is great to be with you today. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. First of all, I want to wish everyone safety and well-being after what sounds like quite an eventful week of storms. I know from personal experience with Samuel as his father that losing power is a very big deal and can be life-threatening. So we really hope you're all doing well and safe, and we are so appreciative for Crew for inviting us. Samuel is going to be joining me live in just a bit, but I'm going to start by kind of kicking things off and hopefully getting your whole conference off on the right foot. And although Ainsley just spoke very eloquently about not wanting to go back, I am going to ask you to go back in your memory for a minute. And what I'd like to do is ask you to picture yourself in a classroom from your own youth, from your grade school years. Here we call it kindergarten or elementary school, middle school, whatever terminology you use. Picture yourself in a classroom, and if it helps, close your eyes for a minute to visualize it. And look around that room and think about and look at, from your memories, what the kids you're alongside looked like, what they were doing together, how they were playing or learning together. Just get a real sense of that classroom. And then ask yourself, were there kids with and without disabilities learning together, becoming friends with each other, being alongside each other in that classroom? Was it a mixed ability classroom? And if your answer is no, that kids with disabilities were largely segregated, then you had a very similar upbringing to me. I grew up in New Jersey in the United States near New York City. And when I was about 4 years old, I was in a preschool. This is me at 4 years old. And in that preschool, I made friends with a boy named Richard. And Richard was a great kid. We used to do random things like carry rocks across the playground because that's what Boys did for no apparent reason. But I just remember Richard being a good friend, a good kid to hang out with. But Richard had one major difference that maybe you can see. He's the boy on the left here in the picture, and Richard had a headband that he wore all the time. And I remember at one point being very curious about this headband and asking my mom, Mom, why does Richard wear the headband all the time? And she explained that Richard had had a lot of ear problems and hearing problems and surgeries, and it was probably to protect his ear from all the dust we were creating, carrying those rocks across the playground. But this is 55 or so years ago now, and I still remember this vivid feeling of Richard being different because he was the kid with the headband. And in some ways, that's very laughable now that that was such a major difference, which I think you'll understand more in just a moment. As I got older, I went to college. I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And at Michigan, there were a lot of very powerful civil rights movements. We were marching against apartheid in South Africa, and we wanted the university to divest in racist countries, and there were LGBTQ movements. But never do I remember there being a disability rights movement. And never do I remember even seeing people on campus with visible disabilities. So right through college, disability was really not something I remember very well being part of my own experience or the experience of the people around me. Now, jumping forward another 12 years from my college graduation, this was the summer of 1999. And my wife Betsy and I had our first son, Isaiah, who's here in the foreground in this picture. And as you can see in the background, a very pregnant Betsy was with our child number two to be determined. And we were extremely happy to be getting ready to have a second child. When I was younger, I have two siblings, and we were very active together. We played a lot of sports together. We were very close. We still are very close. So Betsy and I were really looking forward to this enlarging family and all the things we might do together as a family, going hiking and biking and playing sports and the active life that we hope to have. So when this beautiful child Samuel was born, here you see him at 3 months old, we were ecstatic and exhausted, like all new parents, for the first few months. Not a lot of sleep, but a lot of joy and a lot of love. And then at about 3 or 4 months, we started having a lot of concerns because Samuel wasn't developing in the way that his brother had developed. And his brother was one of these precocious kids that was already taking his first step and saying his first words at about 11 months old. So we were concerned when Samuel wasn't, babbling much when he was 3, 4, 5 months old. He wasn't trying to roll over. He wasn't sitting up or even trying at 6 months or so. So here in the States, we have something called early intervention. Early intervention, you probably have an equivalency there. And you're able to bring in specialists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and it's a federally funded program to assess the child's development. And so they came in and they started doing all these tests on Samuel and watching him roll over. And I remember them saying, is he rolling over at 6 or 7 months? We said, no, not really. Is he babbling much with his language? We said, nope, not really. Is he trying to sit up? Nope. And Betsy and I had this really deflating feeling that they were feeling some of the same fears we were. I remember at one point they said, when you hold him up under his armpits, do his armpits shrug up or do they hold firm? And I said, I think they hold firm. And they said, good, good. And I said, great, I got one right on this test that I really do not want to be taking. And I imagine many of you have been through similar experiences of this coming realization that your fears that the development of your child was not going according to plan was coming to fruition. So we started getting more and more concerned, and we saw a neurologist, and the neurologist, this doctor, took samples of Samuel. He took blood samples and skin samples and urine samples and sent them to these labs all over the country and all over the world to test Samuel's metabolic process. How was he processing food and turning that into energy, and what might be going on? And this was 24 years ago. So this was before a lot of genetic testing was available. And I remember one day getting a call from the doctor, and he said, it looks like Samuel might have a mitochondrial disorder. So why don't you come in a couple of weeks and we'll talk through what that means. Of course, I didn't wait a couple of weeks. I did what no parent should do, but you inevitably do, is ask Dr. Google, right? What is a mitochondrial disorder? And I remember one of the first things that came up on the screen was usually fatal. And I just felt like I had been kicked in the stomach by a horse. It was one of my lowest moments. Now, thankfully, I've learned a lot of things since then. One is that there are many kinds of mitochondrial disorders. Some of them are indeed fatal, many of them aren't. But I've also learned that Samuel doesn't even have a mitochondrial disorder. We learned that at about age 19, which you'll hear more about later from Samuel. But at that moment in time, we were facing this horrible reality of uncertainty and fear and grief, and it was something that we went through and we had to go through this realization that our life was going in a very different direction than we had planned. And frankly, we were really worried about Samuel and his health and his future. My wife wondered how, and she says this in our movie, including Samuel, how can he go to college and make friends when he can't even hold a pencil or walk or ride a bike? And so that uncertainty and fear was not somewhere we wanted to stay. We wanted to go to a different place. And Betsy thankfully found a leadership program here in New Hampshire that helped parents of kids with disabilities and people with disabilities learn advocacy skills. Similar to what you're doing at this conference or Cru, learn how to navigate the educational system, the healthcare system, the legal system, all these systems that none of us were born to know how to figure out, right? But when you have a disability or you have a child with a disability, you're going to have to learn these systems in order to have a full life. And you're going to need to learn to advocate in order to have a full life. So Betsy did this leadership series. I did this leadership series, and both of us came out of it with the same vision for Samuel, which was that we just wanted him to feel like he belonged. We wanted him to feel like he belonged in all aspects of society. And that meant, everything, our community, our neighborhood, our school, our family. Now, thankfully, Samuel very much always had this sense of belonging. He's a real charmer, and he in preschool would just lean over to the girl next to him and flash those great eyelashes, and he would certainly have that sense of belonging. But we didn't know how preschool would translate into the regular kindergarten, first grade, second grade, early elementary school. Thankfully, he went to that elementary school right near our house. It was wheelchair accessible, and he was using a small wheelchair at that point. He was supported by his friends, sometimes quite literally, like for this group photo. And he was wonderfully supported by his teacher, Barbara O'Brien, a brilliant teacher who taught in a kindergarten and first and second grade multi-age classroom. So kids age like 5 all the way till 7 or 8. And she loved that multi-age model. And he felt really supported and a sense of belonging, which was a relief to us because we couldn't imagine how Samuel could possibly feel a sense of belonging in our own community unless he was welcomed into our own local school. And that's at the crux of so much of what Samuel and I are going to talk about this morning or morning your time, night my time this morning, which is that having an experience of being included in your own school is the foundation of everything. And it's why we've advocated so hard for inclusive education. Now, what happened was because Samuel was included in his school, when he had activities outside of school, like being in the Boy Scouts, he felt included there. So when he rolled into that classroom and he used his communication device to say the Pledge of Allegiance, is what we say in a lot of moments here in the States, the kids didn't bat an eyelash. They thought, well, this is the way Samuel rolls. He just does things a little bit differently. When he was in theater and did the play Guys and Dolls, and he said his lines in the play with his communication device mounted to his wheelchair, and he pushed the dice off his lap, everyone saw that as being normal. That was just the way Samuel experienced the world. And so he felt like he belonged on that theater stage. When it was time to play baseball, which he loves playing baseball, and he's a huge sports fan, as Ainsley mentioned earlier, he felt like he belonged on that field. Now, when the kids are young and they're playing t-ball, I don't know if you play that game there where everyone hits off a tee, it's kind of like herding cats anyway. There are kids running up the third base line and across the field and colliding at second base. So nobody really cares about a kid in a wheelchair. But when the kids started getting more competitive and they wanted to win the games and you were out or safe, running to first base, Samuel also is very competitive. So he recruited his brother Isaiah, who's a really good athlete, and Isaiah's friend Nick, another good athlete, to push him up the first baseline as fast as they possibly could. So he got up there, he hit a nice little ball down the third baseline, and they started pushing, but they had forgotten to take the brakes off his chair. And so suddenly Samuel was about to topple over and do a face plant right into the dirt, but they caught him in the nick of time. They tried to run up the first baseline after taking the brakes off, but he was out by a mile. So the second time up, they all got smart. He took the brakes off. hit a nice little ball again up the third baseline, and they started going up that first baseline faster than anybody who's ever gotten in a wheelchair that I've seen. There was dirt flying everywhere, legs, arms. And the problem was that the kid playing first base was not very interested in baseball at all. He's looking up at airplanes in the sky and picking grass out of the ground, about to get run over by this locomotive going up the first baseline. And thankfully, my neighbor Dave was coaching first base, picked the kid up, moved him out of the way. Samuel was safe. Everyone was alive. It was a good day. And Samuel felt like he belonged right through 12 or 13 years old on that baseball field. And he started playing an adaptive bike. His coach here is pushing him up the first baseline, but he felt that sense of belonging right through his 13 years of baseball. And then fast forward a few years, we're now at a point recently where Samuel was coming towards the end of his high school career and getting ready to graduate, and his brother was in college. During high school, Samuel developed a lot of leadership skills that he'll tell you about in his presentation. I don't know if you use the same language in Australia, but we call it the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan. But it's the plan that you come together and make with your teachers and your family members and your occupational therapists, physical therapists, special education teachers. And it's a roadmap, hopefully, to success in school for kids with disabilities. Well, Samuel started co-leading those meetings and learning how to be a leader. And he'd even bring his service dog at the time, Proton, who's under the table, to some of these meetings to take the temperature down a little bit if there was any stress in the room. He, as he'll tell you more in his presentation, has been a college student now for a number of years and very successfully working his way slowly but surely towards his associate's and hopefully his bachelor's degree. So we're so proud of Samuel, but part of what I'm getting at here is about much more than Samuel. Samuel is representative of what we know about inclusion and inclusive education worldwide, which is that kids with disabilities who are included are more likely to have better communication skills, higher academic achievement, wider social networks, fewer behavior problems, more opportunities for higher education, and more meaningful employment as adults. And I've been doing talks like this for 15 years or more, and I've always challenged audience, show me one study that says that segregated, separate environments for kids with disabilities results in better outcomes in any of these areas. And no one has ever shown me a study that shows that separate placements for kids with disabilities results in better outcomes. But there's so many studies, hundreds of studies now, that show inclusion supports these outcomes for kids with disabilities. So why then, in this country, in your country, and worldwide, do we continue to segregate so many students with disabilities? Just in the United States, an example is that 56% of kids with intellectual disability spend the majority of their day segregated in special education environments. And in fact, only about 17% of students with intellectual disability are truly included in school. So one argument I could make, in addition to how it helps kids with disabilities, is it helps kids without disabilities to be in inclusive environments. It actually is a benefit. And there's a couple of ways I'll go about that, making that case. One is a study that was done at Vanderbilt University that showed that kids without disabilities who were learning in inclusive environments, when they're learning alongside their peers, actually scored 15 points higher on their tests. And when they looked at the data and really tried to understand why this was happening, they found that kids without disabilities who were in an inclusive environment were doing a lot of co-teaching of their kids who might be struggling, their peers who might be struggling a little bit. They were approaching the material from a lot of different angles, which we call universal design for learning. They were thinking about it, they were talking about it, they were writing charts, and they were trying to find ways to reach everyone's learning style. And because they were so engaged, because they were teaching each other, because they were talking about it with kids of all different abilities, they learned the material more, they did better on the tests. And there's never been a study I've ever seen that has showed decreased outcomes academically for kids without disabilities who are learning in inclusive environments. So you can certainly make the case academically, but I'd also make the case socially, that socially, what I remember most about school sometimes is like the walks to school more than school itself, and the games we played and the things we talked about. So when you think about how school made you who you are today, if you're an adult now and out of school, or at least out of grade school, what do you think had the most profound impact in terms of school? Was it your identity now as a let me go back for a second. When you think of who you are today as a full person, would you say that the academic experience of school had a bigger impact on you, or was it the social and emotional impact of school? And I can't hear you, so just think about this for a minute. When you think of who you are as a full person, the books you choose to read, the movies you watch, the places you like to travel to, your hobbies, the people you want to spend time with, what had the bigger impact on you? Was it the academic experience of school or the social and emotional? And I don't want to presume, but most people I talk to about this say the social and emotional actually of school had a bigger impact on them. But we seem to only measure schools largely by how well they do in terms of academic achievements, not by the social and emotional impact. And I would argue that a truly diverse school of kids with and without disabilities results in much richer social and emotional impact for kids than a very homogenous school of just kids of one ability, of one type of ability. So this really came to us in a clear way when we made a road trip with some of Samuel's friends. So we went to Cooperstown, New York, which you may or may not know is the home of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And you probably get by now, we're big baseball fans in our family. So Samuel took his childhood friends, Jacob and Fletcher, when they were all about 13, 14 years old, to Cooperstown. And we had a great time in this wonderful museum of baseball. And then we went out to the community to have lunch. And you can see that there was a really big obstacle to Samuel and his friends getting into a restaurant to have lunch. Almost every storefront had a step, 3 inches, 4 inches, whatever it was. That is a wall that you're not going to get past when you're in a 300-pound wheelchair, right? And they were really frustrated that they couldn't get into these stores together. They couldn't believe how hard it was to go out and just have lunch somewhere. So they ended up writing a letter to the people in Cooperstown. They sent it to the newspapers and the local business chamber of commerce. And they said, we are very mad because almost all the stores in downtown Cooperstown are not accessible to someone in a wheelchair. We had $100 to spend and we had a rule. If Samuel couldn't get into the store, then none of us would buy anything from it. We hope that this letter will change downtown Cooperstown before anyone else has to struggle with what we did. And they sent this off to the different people in town. They sent it off to the Chamber of Commerce, the newspapers, all these different places, and they published it. And the amazing thing was that we got a call back from the Chamber of Commerce. And they said, oh, is there any way, Mr. Habib, that you could suggest ways that we could become more accessible in downtown Cooperstown? And I'm thinking, ramps? Ever hear of ramps? They've been around since like the days of the pyramids. But I didn't say anything quite so cynical. I just explained to her that a lot of these thresholds were very low. And I am kind of wondering, like, why did they call a filmmaker hundreds of miles away? Don't you have people with disabilities and architects in your own community? But I was patient. But the amazing thing happened a couple of years later. And we had friends who had family in this community of Cooperstown. And they told us that they went back to see their family a couple of years after this letter was written. And they had totally changed downtown Cooperstown and made almost every storefront accessible. Now, I don't want to pretend that this letter made all that difference. There was probably a plan in the works that was already happening. Maybe it nudged them along a little bit, right? But think about, more importantly, the lessons that experience of writing that letter taught Samuel and Fletcher and Jacob about advocacy, about self-determination, about sticking up for your friends, about human rights, about civil rights, about disability rights. Think of that powerful lesson that they never would have learned if they hadn't all been in school together. Certainly not Fletcher and Jacob. Never would have learned that lesson if they didn't have Samuel as a friend. And those are the lessons that are profound, that are going to last their whole lives, right? So what I'm talking about tonight is not just about Samuel's life or his benefit or some of his classmates. It's really about, what kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of country do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a country where disability is seen as separate and segregated? Or do you want our current sons and daughters and our current nieces and nephews and our grandchildren to know that disability is a normal part of our world? It's part of life, and it needs to be embraced as part of our diversity, not segregated as if there's something wrong or that needs to be fixed, or that people cannot experience, a different look at humankind than you might experience in your own body. We really believe that this mission we're on through film and through advocacy is to change the world with your help and with your collaboration. We want to keep moving forward and not going backwards. And I think a way that I'm going to wrap up before I show a clip from our first film, including Samuel, and then bring Samuel on, I'll wrap up with one last anecdote from Samuel's elementary school. And during his elementary school, he had this wonderful teacher that I mentioned, Barbara O'Brien, who taught this multi-age classroom. And in Concord, New Hampshire, where we live, we've had a lot of refugee resettlement from countries in Africa and Iraq and Bhutan and Nepal, Syria. And they come here, many of them knowing no English language, nothing about the American culture, and they're just plopped into our community and they are plopped into a school and expected to thrive, right? Well, it's very difficult. And so in Samuel's classroom, they had this one child come in from Burundi, and this child had just been in a refugee camp in Kenya. And Barbara O'Brien told me the kids were so incredibly patient with this child and so nurturing and so supportive of this child learning the ways of the classroom and the cafeteria and how to learn and how to, using gestures and hand motions and everything to teach this child. They said they were so patient and compassionate and innovative, and they showed such leadership. And she said, you know what? They learned that from Samuel. They learned that because they had a classmate who didn't talk in a typical way or move in a typical way or walk in a typical way. They learned those types of creative communication and leadership styles. And some of the things I just mentioned, creativity, communication, innovation, collaboration, empathy, patience, these are all really important in the workforce too. For people, that's what companies want to hire these days, are people with these type of skills, not the kid that got an A- in algebra necessarily. So all these ideas, all these, all the work we're doing with our films is all about creating a culture of inclusion and changing hearts and minds. So that's why we get so honored when we get invited to present at incredible events like yours, because we want to be a resource for you. We want to help give you motivation and energy to do your own work to create a culture of inclusion and change hearts and minds. So with that, I'm going to show a clip from the film, Including Samuel. It's just a 3-minute clip. And then we're going to really excited to bring Samuel on to join us and give his presentation. So this is just a 3-minute clip from the film, Including Samuel. Take a bow.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Dan Habib. My wife Betsy and I have 2 boys, Isaiah and Samuel. When I became a photojournalist 20 years ago, I did a story on one of the first elementary schools in New Hampshire to try inclusion, or mainstreaming as it was called at the time. At Beaver Meadow Elementary, kids with disabilities began to join the same classrooms as kids without disabilities. Now my son goes to Beaver Meadow. He has a disability, and I think about inclusion every day.
When Samuel was a baby and we first started realizing that he might have a disability, I remember being really afraid, because all the things you imagine for your child were things I was afraid about. How could he run around on the playground and play kickball when he couldn't run? How could he yak on the phone with his teenage friends when he has trouble talking? How could he get a full education and go to college when he can't hold a pencil? I just couldn't imagine beyond that, and I was very afraid for him and for us.
Are you coming over to me? Are you coming over to me?
I am Isaiah, Samuel's brother. He was born when I was about 3 years old. We love to watch the Patriots games together. You didn't get that, did you? You didn't get that. Teddy Bruschi goes down. We love to play tackle. No, actually, I got you. There's sunlight streaming from his smile.
Samuel likes spaceships. His favorite color is yellow. Does he like sunflowers? I like sunflowers.
Those are Samuel's classmates, his friends. He's going to grow up with these kids, and they'll know him as Samuel, not the kid in the wheelchair.
Well, now I'm very happy that Samuel has joined me for the rest of the presentation, and we're excited to be with you. You're going to learn a lot more from Samuel in just a second about his life. So I hope you enjoyed that little clip from Including Samuel. That was obviously done when Samuel was a lot younger. So we're going to now share a presentation that Samuel has done. And as you listen to Samuel's presentation, think about your own thoughts in terms of what are some of the elements of Samuel's school and life experience that represent a culture of inclusion. And as you go through today and the rest of this conference, hopefully some of these thoughts will really stick with you. What are the elements that really create a culture of inclusion? So without further ado, I'm going to let Samuel bring his presentation up, and he's excited to share it with you. So this is Samuel's My Inclusive Life.
Hello everybody, I'm Samuel Habib. Before we watch the film, I'd like to tell you about my inclusive life growing up, and about my transition planning and advocacy work. I use a communication device to communicate. I can also talk, but it takes a lot of effort and sometimes it is hard for people to understand me. I've been in regular school and classes since preschool. I've kept most of my friends from middle school and made some new friends. I was pretty nervous about going to high school, but it was awesome. One day a girl at school that I like asked me to eat lunch with her. I got so excited that I kicked my feet out and broke the footplate right off of my chair. My favorite class in high school was street law. My teacher was Mr. Boseman. He was funny. The class was really interesting. We got a tour of a police station, a county jail, and had a mock trial in an actual district courtroom. A lot of the time I worked on class assignments with my friends either in person or on Google Docs. I always have my communication device for social and academic communication. The teachers for each of my classes give us a list of key vocabulary for each unit ahead of time for my communication device. That way I can use the words for homework, tests, and contributing to class discussions. When I was in high school, I was part of the school TV station called CHS Life. I did the Red Sox and New England Patriots report each week. I was also on the yearbook staff and the school newspaper. I took photos on my iPhone and did interviews. I was a member of the Be the Change Club. We organized multicultural events at the school and welcomed new Americans who moved to Concord. Since freshman year I have been helping to lead our team check-in meetings with a PowerPoint. Here is an example of the PowerPoint that I would make in advance with my special education coordinator. Each of my teachers would talk about what is going well and what could be improved. I played unified soccer, basketball, and track. Unified sports teams are made up of students with, and without, disabilities competing against other schools with unified sports teams. One summer I had an internship at Concord Community TV. I learned about film editing and talked to campers about the films I've made. I also did an internship with the Concord Monitor newspaper with support from Voc Rehab. I pitched an idea to interview people with sports jobs. We called it the Sports Sit Down. I graduated from Concord High School with a regular high school diploma. After high school, I attended New Hampshire Technical Institute, which is the local community college. I took one college class a semester. I've taken 9 classes, including cultural anthropology, Western civilization, social media strategy, psychology, and contemporary ethical issues. My favorite class so far was mindful communication. We learned about meditation, how to be present in the moment, and the importance of listening when communicating. I've transferred to Southern New Hampshire University in 2025 and I am continuing my education there. I am proud of what I've accomplished in school so far. I have a lot of hobbies and passions. I sometimes ski in the winter and kayak in the summer. I'm a huge NASCAR fan. At some of the races at the New Hampshire Motor Speedway I got to meet some of the drivers, like Kevin Harvick. I love to travel and fly on planes. My dad and I went to see a race at the Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama. My family and I went to Prescott, Arizona to visit my brother Isaiah when he was at college, and we saw the Grand Canyon. A few years ago we went to a game at the Big House at the University of Michigan. My dad went there for college and I want to go back for another game. I went to the Double H Ranch Sleepaway Camp for 7 years. It's in the Adirondacks in New York. We did a ton of fun stuff like swimming, archery, a talent show, go to an amusement park, and a zip line. There were a lot of Yankee fans there, so I had to represent Red Sox Nation. I love listening to music. I've seen a bunch of concerts, like Chris Stapleton, Hozier, Imagine Dragons, the Avett Brothers, Macklemore, and Train. I also want to see Coldplay, Mumford & Sons, and Aloe Blacc. This past summer I had a job at a music venue in New Hampshire called Bank of New Hampshire Pavilion scanning tickets. I got to see a bunch of shows for free after I got off work. I had another gig where I did video interviews with all 8 major candidates in New Hampshire about disability rights issues, including voting rights, funding for adult disability services, special education, healthcare, housing, and employment. The interviews are all on my YouTube channel. I also completed a year-long leadership program through the Institute on Disability. It helped me become a better advocate. I have GNAO1 neurodevelopmental genetic disorder. I found out through genetic testing in March 2019. GNAO1 is caused by a mutation in a protein coding gene. It caused my cerebral palsy and other health challenges. I really don't mind having a disability. I just wish I didn't have so many doctor's appointments and that the world was totally wheelchair accessible, especially my friends' homes. That's why I've advocated for more accessibility at my high school. I couldn't sit with my friends in the bleachers at the basketball games. So I emailed the principal and the athletic director. In the email I said I want to address a problem. I can't get up into the student section of the stands at basketball or football games. I hope you can fix the problem by bringing the student section down to the court and closer to the field. Thanks, Samuel Habib. At the basketball games they moved the student section down so I could sit with my friends. But the city owns the football field and there is not much space for wheelchairs when I'm in the stands. I blocked the aisle so I still can't sit with my friends. So I testified at the city council meeting and asked them to rebuild the football bleachers. I won't give up until the football stands are really wheelchair accessible. There are hard things about being disabled. It's really hard for people to understand my talking, and that is frustrating sometimes. Also, my muscles don't work as well as they used to when I was younger, so it's harder for me now to use my communication device or drive my chair independently. But there are a lot of positive things about having a disability. I have an awesome team of direct support professionals every day. And I love being part of the disability community. Now, we are really looking forward to showing you the film I co-directed with my dad, Dan Habib. Before you watch the film, I'd like to tell you why we made it. I've lived in Concord, New Hampshire my whole life, and as I said, the schools here are pretty inclusive for students with disabilities. But things still felt confusing after I graduated. I wanted to date, get a job, live on my own. But no one tells you how to be an adult, let alone an adult with a disability. I suggested an idea to my dad, who is a filmmaker. How about I interview badass adults with disabilities about their transition to adulthood? I decided to start by interviewing people I already knew, like Judy Heumann, Bob Williams, and Keith Jones because they are people I look up to. They are great advocates and role models for kids and young adults with disabilities. I wanted to ask them and other people I admired about their transition to adulthood to help me and others be successful. Success can be defined in many ways. These are just people I wanted to have as mentors. We wanted to focus on people who would be honest and tell it like it is. So starting in January 2020, I've been interviewing these awesome disabled adults about relationships, work, education, living on their own, healthcare, finding support people, and every part of transitioning to adulthood. We traveled to Indianapolis, New York City, Washington, D.C., and Western Massachusetts to film. I also filmed my own life from my perspective with 2 GoPro cameras mounted on my wheelchair. And my dad has been filming and photographing my transition into adulthood. The short version of the film is called My Disability Roadmap, and it premiered on the New York Times website in May of 2022. We recently finished production of the feature-length film, The Ride Ahead, which we are in the process of releasing now. Enjoy The Ride Ahead.
So we're going to show you just a trailer from The Ride Ahead, but as you heard earlier, there's plans underway already to have the full screening of The Ride Ahead shown this summer. So this is a trailer from The Ride Ahead. Enjoy.
What's up? I'm Samuel Habib. Growing up, my life was pretty awesome. Now, I'm ready to date, move out, and go to college, but it's freaking complicated. One minute I can be getting dressed for the day, and the next minute I'm racing to the ER. People talk down to me.
You are such a cutie.
Kind of talking to him like it's a 5-year-old.
The disability is not define who you are.
I can't believe he stroked my face. Weird. I need to talk to more disabled people who have navigated this stuff, and are living badass adult lives. What is the biggest risk you've taken in your life?
Biggest risk I've taken in my life.
The biggest risk?
Do you feel underestimated because of the way you talk?
Never. I ignore anyone who refuses to accept me.
You have to have ninja patience. If you have a disability, sometimes my patience runs out.
Me too.
Do you have advice for me about sex?
Yes, I do.
If someone doesn't want to date you because you're disabled, that's not the person that you ever want to date. Ever.
One can be sexual without necessarily screwing. And I'm glad my mother's not hearing this discussion.
I don't mind having a disability. I just wish the world was wheelchair accessible.
Hell yes.
I love who I am, but I do not love the impression created on my disability.
The work of achieving social justice for disabled people also means changing societal and cultural values.
What we've been discussing, Samuel, is allowing disabled people to feel proud about who we are. We have a right not to be discriminated against.
I'm tired of being underestimated. I want to find my way.
So if you are interested in learning more about the whole film, we do have a website with a lot of information called the Ride Ahead, rideaheadfilm.com, and I'll leave our social media up there for just a minute. But I know we've worked hard to leave a little bit of time for some Q&A, and Samuel is excited to answer some questions, and I'm excited to answer some questions. So hopefully we can hear and see everyone okay, and we're really excited to take your questions. So I'll hand it off to you, Ainsley, I think.
Thank you so much, Samuel. And thank you to Dan for your presentations and for generously sharing your learnings and allowing us into your world and into your lives. So yeah, we really appreciate that, and I'll say more of the thank you later on. Dan, you let the cat out of the bag a little bit early, but that's all good. The Ride Ahead that you just saw, I'm really pleased to say that come July, Crew will be providing a screening of the Ride Ahead. So keep your eye on emails as they come forward. So I've had the pleasure of viewing the full version of the Ride Ahead, Samuel. The mentors you interview give powerful advice. Is there one piece of advice that you've most taken to heart that may benefit other young adults with disabilities?
The advice I got from Maysoon was, "You are not alone. Find your community." That was powerful advice because I've always had a strong community, starting with Beaver Meadow Elementary School and right through Concord High School. I'm continuing to find my community at my summer job at a concert venue, at work at the Westchester Institute for Human Development, in the disability justice community, and in my hometown of Concord.
Thank you, Samuel. Yeah, I'll speak a little bit later about my own son who's 17, and yeah, that continued work that he does and our family does, and that community being the most important thing for him as well. Thank you. Now, I do have our fabulous Diana Kerr. She's going to run with questions. We do have a couple of questions, or 3 questions first up, that we have ready for Samuel. So I will get Di to take you to those people. And if needed, I will just repeat questions so it's clear as well at this end.
Hi, Samuel. My name is Michelle. I'm mum to a 14-year-old girl with cerebral palsy. This question is very close to my heart because my gorgeous girl is the first in Australia to board with her level of disability in boarding school. So I'm very proud of her. What advice do you have for school leaders and future educators to create a space that values and includes all students?
Was that clear enough? Would you like me to repeat?
Create a sense of belonging. Have high expectations for all students. Make the entire building and extracurricular activities accessible.
So I think hopefully you all heard that okay. Don't, very clearly stated by Samuel, don't segregate, make the entire building accessible, high expectations. And I'll just add that, you know, I've done a lot of work in schools all over the place, and without strong leadership that really believes in this, it's very difficult to make inclusion stick, to make it work. And I'm hoping we can save 3 minutes at the end of our session to show one more video that really illustrates that type of leadership, because all of you in the room who are advocating in your own ways, keep doing it. I mean, everyone needs to feel that pressure, if you want to call it pressure, or that advocacy. But the ultimate goal is to get the leadership to really believe this with their hearts and minds, that this is right for their community, it's right for their whole student body. And examples like you just gave of your daughter going to boarding school, maybe the first one with that type of disability to be successful, that's also what's needed. It's path breakers, people who show that there's a way to make this successful, and that it really should be more the norm than the exception, right? For kids with disabilities to have access to all aspects of our educational system and our employment system as well.
Thank you, Samuel and Dan. And we do have some school staff from schools across Queensland here today. So yes, it's work that we, the leaders, we charge them with, but we all can play our role, as you say. We have another question.
Hi, thank you, Samuel and Dan. That was a wonderful presentation. I have a son with intellectual disability who uses signing and a communication device. And Samuel, I was just wondering if you could share any advice on how to best communicate with people who use alternative forms of communication.
Be patient and do not talk down to me. Ask me how I best communicate. Slow down the pace of the conversation to create more space for me to contribute. If you don't understand me, ask me to repeat what I said. If I'm typing on my device, don't start another conversation. Please wait for me to finish.
Yeah, I love what Samuel says there. And I think we as a family have learned to be very patient and to create space for Samuel to communicate in his own way. But the world is not always like our family, right? So we need to teach the world that if you show high expectations for people with communication challenges, if you create space for them, if you show patience, they want to tell you who they are. They want to tell you their thoughts, and they want to ask you questions. But we have found, and perhaps you have found in the room, if you don't create that space, the person draws inside themselves. They become more internal, and they need to feel that they're going to have the space to communicate in a world that often moves so fast. And I grew up in a fast talking New Jersey Jewish family, and it took a lot of time for us to figure out how to create space. And my parents, who are in their mid-90s and still alive and still doing well, just learned in the last few years how to create that space for Samuel. So it's never too late, even in the early 90s. It's never too late to learn how to create that space.
Thank you. Very important learning there with the creating space. We have, thank you to Carly who asked that question. Now over to Andrea, I believe.
Hey, Samuel. My name's Andrea. I have a little guy also who has cerebral palsy. He's 9 years old, and it was really exciting to hear how your life's unfolded. And I'm really interested to know what your dreams are for the future.
I dream about traveling around the country and the world. I want to go to the Football Hall of Fame in Ohio, the Negro Baseball League Hall of Fame in Kansas City, London, and Europe. And of course Australia. I want to experience going hunting, scuba diving, and continue building an RC boat collection. I also think a lot about getting married, maybe having kids, and making more films like a history documentary.
Yes, we were talking earlier today about what it might take to get to Australia, and we've talked with Ainsley and others about this, and we would love to do it. It's just a long and somewhat scary airplane ride from New Hampshire. We've had many airplane adventures, some of which we do not want to repeat, but it's a place that's definitely on our bucket list. And I think part of what Samuel has taught us is just always having things to look forward to is such a wonderful part of life, and having experiences and shared experiences, I think I've learned, is one of the most beautiful parts of life, just sharing experiences with your friends, with your family. And Samuel's always thinking of new things to do and new ideas. He had identified a goal probably 2 years ago to go watch baseball spring training in Arizona and see that, have that experience. We just did that last week, thanks to Samuel's drive. And sometimes it's something much more modest, like seeing a bald eagle, in the sky, or seeing a moose in the northern New Hampshire. So there's so many different things you can look forward to. And I think one thing that Samuel's also taught us is innovation and creativity, and how to be nimble and how to be creative in achieving goals that might need to be achieved in a little bit of a different way than other people. So anyway, we really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you virtually, but hopefully someday we can all be together in person.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? We hope the technology with planes improves and we can get you here smoother and faster.
That's a good idea.
I will open up now. We've got about 5 more minutes, and we can open up to other questions that people may have for Dan and for Samuel. So if you have a question, Di, our wonderful runner, will come to you. I think I spot someone over right on this side. Or Lindy.
Thanks, Dan and Samuel. It was lovely to hear from both of you. I was just interested if you could tell us a little bit more about the unified sports team experience that you had. My experience here is that it's still a little bit segregated. So they might call it inclusive, but it's just for kids with disabilities. So how do you if you can reflect on if you had to make that change yourself, or whether it had already happened, but how to actually get there would be good.
Sure. I can address that a little bit. And in part, this is also an opportunity for me to explain how Samuel prepares for events like this. Samuel has thought about and dictated out like 60 or 70 different comprehensive answers to questions we get, but it's very hard for him to do it on the fly. So that's why we worked with the organizers to think about some questions ahead of time. But so I'll answer this question. In the state, part of Special Olympics, which I'm sure you're familiar with and is international, they do have an area of their work called that's very specifically called Unified Sports. So it's Special Olympics Unified Sports. And the model, if you go to their website, is truly supposed to be integrated sports. So when the Unified Sports programs here in the States are one high school will have a soccer team and they'll compete against another high school with a soccer team, but on both teams, there are kids with and without disabilities. So true unified sports in that model is an inherently inclusive model of kids with and without disabilities, as opposed to what's more traditionally thought of as Special Olympics, which is typically just kids with disabilities. So I would it's hard for me to describe much more than that, but I think if you go to the Unified Sports website on Special Olympics, you'll see that. But it takes some initiative from the school to start a team, and then you have to have other schools that also have these teams. So if it's not there already, I hope you guys can create some momentum for that unified approach. It was a really wonderful way for Samuel to have that sports experience right through high school. He played soccer, you did soccer, basketball, and track pretty much all year round. He had a sports team to play on.
Thank you. I was really keen for that question to be asked as well. So thank you. Keen to try and make that happen in Australia. Di's running to the other side of the room. And thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for sharing all those beautiful stories. I'm really impressed by the way you're using technology to communicate. Would you be able to share a couple of important milestones in the way to choose your preferred technology to come all that way, which is really impressive?
Well, let's see, Samuel, you have some thoughts about communication. Let me see. And our film also, we were very conscious about using the Ride Ahead, which you haven't seen yet, but you'll see hopefully in its entirety, to teach people about communication technology and how it's used. So Samuel does have some thoughts on that he can share.
My communication device is so important in my life, so it's with me all the time. But it is really slow and frustrating to use a device, especially because it's gotten harder to move my arms because of my GNAO1 neurodevelopmental disorder. And it is really hard for me to talk. That's why we put the scene in the film where I'm speaking out the words one by one, and my dad is repeating them. Then we show him programming them into the device. I think that shows that it takes a long time to get the words into my device. We also showed Bob slowly typing his words in his scene. We also wanted to show that I communicate better with people that are patient, and who talk to me in an age-appropriate way.
So as Samuel says here, when you see the full film, you'll see a lot of the strategies and the process to using a communication device. And as Samuel also says, his specific disorder has actually made it harder for him to use it fluently, but he really likes to prepare for presentations like this very carefully. What I'll say in terms of milestones is when kids are younger, it's really important that they're introduced to whatever technology works for them from a very early age. And that can be very low-tech technology like picture boards, but more and more they're finding that even higher tech technology, iPads or communication devices, are appropriate for very young kids. And there used to be some misconception that introducing communication technology to a child would inhibit or suppress their ability to speak verbally. And that's not at all true. It's just the opposite, that having a combination of modalities, being a multimodal communicator, being able to use communication devices, your voice, your gestures, your facial expressions, as we all do, right? I mean, now we use technology every day, our phones, our computers, Zoom, but we're also using, like I am, gestures, like Samuel is, his great smile, that's all the way we communicate. So this is just one part of Samuel's communication, but it's really important for kids with communication disorders to have access to this from a young age. And actually, Ainsley, unless there's another pressing question, this would actually be a really great time for me to show that last clip because it has a lot to do with this question.
2-minute clip.
2-minute clip. Here we go. Let's just do it. And this is, I think, a way to really summarize so much of what we talked about today in terms of creating a culture of inclusion. And you don't know when you're going to need that culture of inclusion. So we'll conclude with this.
Ladies and gentlemen, your principal, Jane Connolly.
Wouldn't it be nice if we were older, then we wouldn't have to wait so long?
We invited every one of the 1,600 kids at Concord High School to think of a question they might have for him.
Hi, Mr. Connolly. What is your greatest accomplishment?
Mr. Connolly, what's your biggest fear?
Students asked about pretty much everything.
Hey, Mr. Connolly. I really want to know what you do to manage your flawless hair. I think it's amazing.
Students asked even the very toughest questions.
Have you ever considered assisted suicide or euthanasia?
To be 100% honest with you, I have thought about it. However, I am one of the world's all-time optimists. I have lost the use of my vocal cords, but because of modern technology, I have a machine that allows me to speak. However, all of you are missing my Boston accent.
Nice. Oh my god, yeah, there's definitely a strong resemblance. No doubt, the smile.
What was your first reaction when you found out you had ALS?
I remember leaving the doctor's office and my wife getting sick in the parking lot.
It's hard to tell somebody that it's going to be all right or things get better. Just embrace it and love him and get as much as you can every day.
That is when it hit me that this disease was going to kill me.
My son Samuel has had a disability since birth.
Does he like sunflowers? I like sunflowers.
Now Samuel was headed off to Concord High. I knew Connolly was devoted to making the school a welcoming place for every kid.
That's what kids feel, his real, genuine love for them.
Well, an inspiration to us all, Gene Connolly.
Life is full of challenges. We get little say in what happens to us, but everything to say in how we deal with it.
So I'll just say, here was a man that created a culture of inclusion within his school, not knowing that someday he would be the beneficiary of that culture of inclusion. So I think that's a really, I hope, a wonderful and powerful story to end on. So I know you needed to go and move on. We really appreciate being with you today. It was just wonderful. And Samuel, you ready to say goodbye? Bye. Samuel said goodbye. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate being with you. Bye. Bye.